Greetings. This is Griff Ruby, the Nostalgia Catholic, summing up and doing kind of a retrospection of my Asimov story reviews. I have finally reached the very end of what I'm going to do in this particular series. So, in all of that, 234 of his stories I have reviewed. Of all those 234, only 22 cases did I not have the original release of the story to the public. So that's actually less than 1 in 10 that I'm missing such a thing. That's 212 of these stories are all seen in their original release, which in particular includes the entire span, and a bit more than that, of the stories that were talked about in the early days. The original emphasis being to explore the beginnings of his story writing career. That's what the early Asimov covered, and I wanted to most especially make sure that I have that too. So, but even as you get along, most of the stories that I cover their original publication, as well as whatever reissues, or at least important reissues, they might have. Important reissues might be if it's only out in some one other place, like it's kind of rare, or in other cases, if it just gets into any one of the many standard collections of Isaac Asimov short stories, or other volumes of Asimov's writings and so forth, in which some one or another might be collected here and there, such as his autobiography, or his Opus 100, or you get the idea. Now, that is, of course, all the stories that he has written. In fact, I compiled a list. Well, I went through a list that's compiled, mostly by somebody else, and it listed 421 individual stories, not counting his novels. Okay, not counting novels, but other stories, parts of stories. There is a fine distinction I'd had to draw here, but let's go look at this. 14 are in the category of lost or incomplete / abandoned. So a total of 9 early stories are lost. They were lost way back when. Actually, 11 were thought of as lost when we collected stories in the early Asimov. 2 of those 11 have since shown up. I didn't count one of those in my numbering. You notice I say 232 is my last story number. Well, the 0th installment, if you want to call it that, had a very early story, not a science fiction story, but the first story he wrote that saw print in his high school days about little brothers. So that was presented in that first introduction. And the other reason we're down by 1 story is because Big Game, one of the lost stories as listed in the early Asimov, is in fact but a really early and rudimentary draft of what would later emerge as another story called Day of the Hunters. They are essentially the same story, but are told rather differently at different occasions, where he seems to have rethought of the same concept all over again, without any clear reference from one to the other, but it's the same story. You could say he plagiarized himself, but that's okay in that instance. So that's why there's only 232 numbered stories in this series, even though there's 234 that are reviewed, because A, the 0th is covered in the introduction, and the 2 stories of Big Game are considered together. Other than that, every story gets its own installment. Now, there's 9. Now, there's also another 5 stories that he had started and just gave up. When he stopped writing in 1958, he abandoned a 7th Lucky Star novel, Lucky Star in the Snows of Pluto. Gone. He started another Elijah Bailey novel, The Bounds of Infinity, but his heart just wasn't in it. It never got finished. I don't even know what, if any of that even either of those exist among his papers. Nobody's bothered to dig that out, and I don't have access to his papers. So, and there's a few other stories that he had started, but just didn't really follow through with. Okay, there's the 234. There's another, what I call serialized installments. Now, this gets into a fine distinction. There are a number of his early novels, complete list, well, would be The Stars Like Dust, or Tyran in its original installment publication, The Caves of Steel, The Currents of Space, and The Naked Sun. Also, The Gods Themselves, Fantastic Voyage. And of course, these would appear in 2 or 3 installments. But the thing was, the story was written as a single whole story, and then it got chopped up by the editors of one or another magazine as they ran it and serialized it, and in the case of Fantastic Voyage, on the pages of Saturday Evening Post, also slightly abridged it, but very smoothly. You wouldn't notice it. It's pretty nicely done, I'd have to say. The editors did this. You see, they really weren't meant to stand alone, and they don't stand alone. They go together. They were serialized stories. I did not include those sections, and there's 14 that come in that category, all taken together. He wrote 66 Black Widower stories. Someday I hope to be able to go through the Black Widower volumes. That's where they would be found, and I would just cover the stories there. I don't want to drill into how they originally came out. I'm just running out of my limit. Okay. There's another 55 stories that are Union Club stories. A bunch of them are in the Union Club Mysteries book. As for the rest, I haven't made any clear decision what I want to do about those. At least all the Black Widower stories are all in the books that were published of that title. Black Tales of the Black Widowers, More Tales of the Black Widowers, Casebook of the Black Widowers, Puzzles of the Black Widowers, Return of the Black Widowers. Maybe there's another, but you get the idea. It's all in there. Alright. There are 28 stories that are about Azazel. Well, the 29th kind of started as a Union Club story, which did not get thrown into the Union Club book, by the way, and doesn't seem to be much of anywhere. And apparently there's some addition. Not all 28 Azazel stories got gathered up in the volume of Azazel, but the rest do appear to have been covered. Perhaps someday I may revisit that. There's also 10 Norby the Robot stories. More kiddie books about robots. Let's just say those are way, way, way at the bottom of my priority list. There's a whole lot of other Asimov and non-Asimov material I can cover before I would even think about trying to get into those. So that all totals up to 421 stories, other than his novels. So, all in all, it's been very interesting to see how all of these came out. So, you can look at how many stories there are. My goodness, there's just so many. And it's been an interesting time. Here I am, how many years later, from when I first started this series. I didn't think I'd get all the way through all of these stories, such as I've done. I figured I'd do the early series. I was really concerned with that because I really liked the early stories because I could watch his writing grow and develop. And then in the 1950s, he's pretty much matured, and he's enough to write truly worthwhile novels, some of which I've covered and more of which I hope to get to soon. But he could still make some mistakes in his short stories, some embarrassments even. So he's still kind of learning. And then we come into the dearth of the 60s where he barely writes anything at all. And then he gets back into writing short stories again. There's a trickle of them through the 1960s, but as you get back into the 70s, it comes up again. And of course, then there's all these different varieties of the Black Widowers and Union Club and Azazel, and towards the very end, the Norby the robots, and so on. Plus a lot of valid stories, which all remaining of which I've covered in this series. So I didn't know how far I would get. His early was most interesting. The next, though, was also pretty interesting. The part where it drops down was also kind of interesting, because there are also some particular stories beyond that I wanted to get to. And I had originally thought, well, maybe I'll just skip around and do it if it's rare or interesting or something. Like I wanted to do the Mirror Mirror one about the one other time that Elijah Bailey meets up with robot Daniel Oliver. So, I mean, I was definitely bent on doing that one. And by the time I was getting close to that, I figured just do it in context, because there's still a lot of really neat stories. And some stories I really like, Waterclap, Bicentennial Man, and so forth, that are real classics. And then I get further along, and I realize, well, you know, I'm keeping going. There's still some interesting stories. Next thing you know, I'm getting so close to the end. Man, just go for broke. Just go for broke. Do it all. And there it is, and I am very pleased and proud to be able to conclude and finish the series of short stories, other than the categories I've set aside, that Isaac Asimov wrote. And if anyone's made it through all of these and managed to stay awake through them all, I congratulate you. And anyone who just finds these, it's a good place to look up individual stories. I hope you found me to be quite a resource. To all of you, thanks for listening.